The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Thomas. Jesus says, "Whoever does not hate his father and his mother as I do cannot become a disciple to me. And whoever does not love his father and his mother as I do cannot become a disciple to me. For my mother gave me falsehood, but my true mother gave me life." They said to Jesus, "Come, let us pray together today and let us fast." Jesus said, "What is the sin that I have committed? Or wherein have I been defeated that I should fast? But when the bridegroom leaves the bridal chamber, then let them fast and pray." Jesus says, "Whoever knows his father and his mother will be called the child of the whore." Jesus says, "When you make the two into one, then you will become truly human beings." The gospel inspired by God. How many of you can remember back to being young parents? Great. And having a child in the 2 to 3 age range. Yeah, good. And how many of you in that category can remember on more than one occasion, let's say it's a little girl of 2.5 or almost 3, flouncing around the kitchen, really, really mad at you because you didn't give her what she wanted, and putting her hands on her hips and saying, "I hate you." Ever happened to anybody here? Okay. No, didn't happen. You were perfect children, Margaret. And then the very same day, the very same child, and you're tucking her into bed at night. She's had her bath and she smells great. She's got her little pink pajamas on her, and you're reading her a bedtime story. And she says to you in this angelic voice, as she puts her hands around your neck, "Mommy, I love you." Ever happened to anybody here? Okay. Same child, same day? Okay. So it seems like such a child would be a perfect candidate to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. If you listen to what he says in the gospel today, she'd be the perfect candidate. Because according to Jesus, the perfect candidate, has to hate her mother and her father in order to be the disciple of Jesus. And she has to love her father and her mother in order to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. So the kingdom of heaven is full of 2-year-olds throwing tantrums, oscillating between loving God and hating God. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to make just 3 main points this morning. I'm going to talk about hating your parents. And then secondly, when you make the two into one. And then I want to talk about the question of fasting that Jesus raises in today's gospel. So the first one, hating your parents. I've said many times that, in my opinion, Jesus was the first and the ultimate shock jock. He has an extraordinary penchant for presenting his teachings in a really, really startling fashion. Paradoxically, like Zen koans, and really just startles his audience. And so to say today, unless you hate your father and mother, as I do, like I hate my father and mother, he's saying, you cannot become disciples for me. Now, obviously, you can't take that literally, because his very next statement is, unless you love your father and mother as I love my father and mother, you cannot become my disciples. But the entire passage is a short passage, and I've edited a little bit. I left out a bunch of other stuff that wasn't pertinent to today's gospel. In some of the other sections, he says, the person who knows who his father and his mother are will be called the child of the whore. So if you think you know who your parents are, you're illegitimate. It's when you don't know who your parents are that you're really legitimate. So what in God's name is the guy on about? So he's this master of shocking tactics and master of paradox. So obviously, to understand, he says, as well in today, he says, my mother taught me falsehood, but my true mother gave me life. So who is this mother who's oscillating between falsehood and life, between being a prostitute and being the one who gave him life? So he's all over the place today until we learn how to understand what he means. So in order to understand the passage, obviously, I want to take 2 key words and I want to parse them, unpack them differently. So we have to understand, what does he mean when he's using the terms father and mother? And what does he mean when he's using the terms hate and love? Because if we don't get that, this reading doesn't make any kind of sense to us. And so when he says, unless you hate your mother and father, as I hate my mother and father, you cannot become my disciple. So what is the mother and father he's talking about here? He's talking about a mindset. He's not talking about an earthly parent. He's not talking about the woman who carried me in her womb. He's talking about the mindset or the cosmology or the theology that gave birth to my self-identity. So if I'm identified with my physicality, then Peggy O'Leary gave birth to me. She is my mother. Now, can I hate this woman? Or do I need to love this woman? So when Christ talks about, unless you hate your mother and hate your father, he's obviously not talking about our earthly parents. He's talking rather about the cosmology or the theologies or the belief systems that gave rise to our sense of self. And these cosmologies really have prostituted themselves, because most of us are brought up in a belief system that we are our physical bodies. That we are either we're our physical bodies, or we are our emotions, or we are our belief systems, or we're the roles we play, or we're the jobs we do. So the cosmologies have bred us to believe, that we are all of these things and we're none of them. So that's what Jesus is talking about when he talks about the mother or the father who gave birth to us. He's not talking about Joseph, or he's not talking about Mary. He's talking about the mindset of the time. He's talking about the culture. He's talking about the paradigm that misleads people and leads us into falsehood. And the falsehood is that we identify with this physical spacesuit. So, of course, a man and a woman they didn't give me life. Nobody gives you life except God. Your parents, your earthly parents, give you a spacesuit. They give you a container in which you live out in incarnation, but they don't give you life. The one who gives you life is your heavenly Father, heavenly mother. So the next statement then is, unless you love your father and your mother, as I do, you cannot be my disciples. In other words, if you haven't understood who your real parents are, that your real parent is source, it's an ineffable source, unless you understand that, you can't be my disciple. And so you have to love the one and hate the other. But then what he means by love and hatred are very different also, because he's this shock jock trying to startle us. So by hating your father and your mother, he's not talking about being disrespectful or rejecting or getting angry at something. He's talking about not identifying with. So what he's using as hatred is to distance from or to kind of disidentify with. So we have to learn how to disidentify with the parents that created our self-image. And the parents that created our self-image were not just our earthly parents, it was the entire culture and the entire belief system in which we grew up. That is what gave us our sense of identity. And so Christ is saying, unless you learn to reject that and not identify with that, you're not even on the beginning of the road. Unless you learn to identify with who your real parent is, who your real father is, and your real mother, that it is source itself, then you haven't understood what it's about. And so how are we meant to relate then to our earthly parents? We're meant to relate them out of complete love, because they're part of what I've called many times a preconception contract. Souls move from incarnation to incarnation as groups. And very, very probably, the woman who gave birth to you in this lifetime may well have been your own child in another incarnation, either before this one or after this one. So our parents do not give us life. They give us spacesuits. They give us containers in which life lives out in incarnational experience. So we can learn how to love in all kinds of configurations. And so we travel as these soul groups from lifetime to lifetime. And the one who was mother to me in this lifetime may have been my child or my brother or my sister in a previous or in the next incarnation. And so in that sense, we have to respect them and love them, because they're the ones who are offering us the opportunity of experiencing the kinds of situations and configurations in which we extend ourselves and learn how to love in all kinds of circumstances. So hating is not about being angry at or rejecting. It's about not identifying with. And loving is not feeling mushy towards somebody. It is about learning to identify with the core essence. And so the parents we love and the parents we hate, are the cultural belief systems that have trapped us into physicality and the source which liberates us for enlightenment. So that's my first point. Second point then, when you learn how to reduce the two down to one, then Christ says, then you will be truly human beings. Human beings in the very best sense of the word. In other words, souls on safari on planet Earth. Spirits in spacesuits. The true human being is the human being who's understood that you're on safari, you're on a journey, you're a spirit in a spacesuit. You've undertaken incarnation so as to test your ability to be loving and compassionate in all circumstances and in all configurations. Whether you were born as a slave girl in North Africa in the 1300s, or you were born as a multimillionaire in Silicon Valley in the 21st century, the question is, can you love in that configuration? Can you be compassionate in that configuration? Can you be just in that configuration? And so we travel in these soul groups together. And that's the object of the exercise, is to create these opportunities. So when we learn then to collapse the two down into the one, what does he mean by this? It means that we have understood that there are two aspects to our life in God. There is the disincarnate aspect, when we're pure souls in the presence of Source. And there's the aspect where we're incarnated beings, inside these spacesuits with all the limitations that the spacesuits involve in the cultures which limit us. So we have to learn how somehow to collapse these two pieces onto each other, to realize that they're just two facets of the same diamond, and that they're not separate from each other. And so when we learn how to make one of the two, it means we learn how to let go of duality and think non-dualistically. That we see our earthly life as an aspect, just a phase in our journey back into Source. So there are just two phases to the same journey. There's the pre-incarnational phase, there's the incarnational phase, there's the post-incarnational phase, there are reincarnational phases. So it's this extraordinary cycle of life where we present ourselves with opportunities and configurations that stretch us into being loving, compassionate beings in all kinds of circumstances. Now, we live in a world in which it is very dualistic, it's very materialistic, and it's very reductionistic. So the entire scientific model is predicated on understanding stuff by destroying it. So we think we can understand life, for instance, by vivisection. You take a living thing and you kill it and you chop it up into pieces in order to find out how it works. I mean, this is ludicrous kind of thinking. To think that we can understand life by killing it and chopping it up into pieces and looking at the constituent elements and then saying, now I understand what life is about. It would be the equivalent of taking the complete works of Shakespeare's, a huge big tome, and thinking, I really want to understand Shakespeare. And so what I do is, through a chemical process, I manage to extract all the ink from all the pages, and I now have 2 ounces of ink in a little bottle, and then I take the rest of the book and I pulp it, and I wind up with 8 pounds of pulped paper. And I say, now I get Shakespeare, I understand Shakespeare. Shakespeare is 8 pounds of pulp paper and 2 ounces of ink. And we think we've understood Shakespeare. And that's pretty much, the world in which we live. The reductionistic thinking. We think that we can understand the cosmos by dividing it up into galaxies. 150 billion of them. And then we can understand galaxies by dividing it up into the solar systems. There's about 150 billion solar systems in each galaxy. And then we think we can understand, each solar system by taking one of the planets and examining it. And we think we can understand the planet by looking at the material composition of it and breaking that down into its molecular structure and its atomic particles and its subatomic elements and say, now we understand the universe. Of course we don't understand the universe. The opposite is exactly what needs to happen. It is the process of seeing the one in the many that makes us spiritual people, not the process of seeing the many in the one. That's exactly the opposite direction. It's our ability to see the presence of God in everything and to realize this is an extraordinary symphony. It's a work of art. You can't understand a symphony, by breaking it up into the wind instruments and the brass and whatever and looking at the particular, players. You get it by listening to the totality of the sound that's emanating from all people working together in harmony. We understand the universe only like that, not by breaking it up into its constituent elements. And this is what Christ is saying. It is this reductionistic model where you attempt to understand stuff by breaking it down into constituent parts and examining them under a microscope. That doesn't give us the secret to life. It doesn't allow us to understand what God is about. It's only having the ability to look in the pluriformity of manifestation and recognize the underlying unity in all of it. That's why I love that part of our Eucharistic prayer where we talk of God as a mathematician. God is a mathematician who loves to play with binary codes, with base 4 and 6 and 8, with real numbers and with irrational numbers and rational numbers, who from the one created the partnership of the two, and from the two created the many, and then from the many collapsed all back down into the one, which vanishes into the womb of nothingness, awaiting rebirth. That's the secret. It's the ability to go in the opposite direction from what science is typically telling us and what life is typically telling us. It is the ability not to take the one and reduce it to the many, but to take the many and to recognize the one. And so here's what Christ is saying today. When you have that ability, whether you're looking at a quasar, or you're looking at a rock, or you're looking at a daffodil, or you're looking at the poetry of Shakespeare, to be able to recognize in all of those manifestations the underlying life of Source itself. That Christ says. When you get that, then you are true human beings. Then you've understood both your origin and your incarnation and your destiny. You've understood all those parts. But if you insist in seeing the two, or you insist in seeing the many, and you can't recognize the unity underlying all of that, you haven't understood what it is to be a true human being. You've come onto planet Earth specifically to experience incarnation so that you can test yourself to be able to look beyond the apparent pluriformity of manifestation and recognize the underlying unity at the core and at the soul of all of it. My third point is this. Christ talks about fasting today. Interesting, this gospel came up as well on, I believe it was Saturday morning, Matthew's version of it. But in Thomas's version today, the disciples say to Jesus, let's pray and let's fast. And Christ says to them, why do I need to fast? What sin have I committed? What am I repentant for? Who has defeated me that I need to fast? And so I want to examine for a few minutes what the notion of fasting was then and what Christ's notion is. Because he said, when the bridegroom is with them, there's no need to fast. But when the bridegroom is taken away, then you will fast. So what are the two kinds of fastings, or what are the two eras of fasting he's talking about? Typically, fasting was an ancient notion that somehow, if I have transgressed and if I've offended God, then before God gets to punish me, I'll punish myself. So that when God looks down and sees, that I'm punishing myself, it won't be necessary for God to punish me. So we create all these systems where you think you can kind of preempt God's anger by, punishing yourself. So you committed a sin, you realize it, you're afraid God is going to strike you, with lightning, and so you go out and you start fasting, and you sit on a dunghill, and you pour ashes on your head, and you take off all your fine clothes, and you dress in sackcloth, and you look like a total wreck. And God looks down and says, all right, how can I punish that poor Angashore down there? I mean, look at him. It would be totally heartless to add to his discomfort. And so the idea was, I can beat God to the punch. By catching it in time, by going through these kinds of rituals, I can save God from punishing me. So fasting originally was this way of kind of doing an end run around God's anger. And it comes from what I've called stage 2 religion. I believe that religion goes through 4 very distinct kinds of phases. The phase 1 religion happened, with the advent of Homo sapiens sapiens, when we first developed language skills, and we had the ability not just to think, but to be able to think about thinking. So we could reflect and we could kind of look around us and try to examine the world in which we lived and try to make sense of it. We asked ourselves the great existential questions. Who made all of this? What happens when we die? And so the first stage of religion is, I call it the age of theology. It is talking about God, or talking about the gods, because there were polytheistic systems at that stage. So the first stage of religion is where we talk about the gods. We're trying to figure out who they are, what they do, and what our relationship to them is. The second stage of religion, I would say, it is talking to the gods. And this is the era of the priesthood. This is when we develop rituals and prayers of various kinds and sacrifices of various kinds and fasting. Because this now is an effort to try to manipulate the gods. Now, science does the very, very same thing. Science goes through 3 stages, typically. The first stage of science is to try to understand the natural world. The second stage of science is to try to predict what the natural world is going to do next. And the third stage of science is to try to control the natural world. So science goes through 3 stages. Understand it first, predict it second, and then try to control it third. Religion went through the same thing. So the first stage of religion was trying to understand the gods. The second stage was trying to predict how the gods would behave and trying to manipulate their responses to us. And fasting was a way of doing that. And prayer was a way of doing that. And sacrifices was a way of doing that. There were 2 more stages to religion after that. The third one I call the era of the prophets, where it is not talking about the gods, or not talking to the gods, but talking on behalf of the gods. So at this stage we have people, either a race like Judaism, which claimed that it was the chosen people and that God only spoke to humanity through the Jews, or you had individual people like the prophets who claimed that God didn't even talk to the entire group, he just talked to me, and I'll tell you what he said. And so the third stage of religion is that where people purport to speak on behalf of God. And the fourth stage of religion, I call it the era of the mystics, and it's where we speak as God, not to God, not about God, and not on behalf of God, but as God. We begin to realize that there is only God, and that everything that exists is a manifestation of the divine. And therefore anything that speaks, anything that utters, is speaking somehow as God. It's a manifestation of the divine. Now, this is not egoic narcissism, where I think I'm God and I'm speaking as God, but that everything that exists is an articulation of the divine. Everything that exists is the Word of God made flesh. That's the third stage. So fasting originally came out of a second stage religion, where we try, now that we've understood the gods, can we try to predict their behavior or even manipulate their responses to us by preempting their anger against us. So at that stage, this is when the disciples say to Jesus, let's fast. And Christ says, why should I fast? What law did I break that I need to be, afraid of God? Yeah. So Christ is not buying into this model. But finally he says, there will come a time when you will fast. So what will be the fasting? What will fasting look like in stage 4 religion? It is not about preempting God's anger. It's not about cowering in front of, God's wrath. It's a totally different function. In a stage 4 religion, fasting is about experiencing the solidarity of my fellow human beings who don't have food. 1 billion human beings go to bed hungry every night. And so fasting is not about, a journey into personal sanctity, where by fasting I'm going to feel really, really good. I'm going to become an enlightened being. Fasting is never about individual enlightenment or individual sanctification. It is about experiencing solidarity with those who are doing without food. And by then, therefore, extending my compassion and justice to these people. So it's a totally different understanding of fasting. It is not about personal salvation. It is not about, protecting myself against the wrath of God. It's about experiencing in my own body what it is like to be a little child in Africa going to bed hungry, for the umpteenth time in a short little lifetime, and then doing something about it. And when I say that, it's not about personal sanctification. It's not about me getting to heaven, by fasting and being really good. Look, me, I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all I possess, like the Pharisees said. It is not about that at all. It is about, experiencing the human condition. And not just even the human condition. It is about experiencing any life form which has been forced to do without. It is about experiencing the deprivation that any sentient being anywhere in the universe is experiencing because of circumstances or because of greed on the part of other sentient beings. So it's extending both my love, my empathy, my compassion, and my justice to all living beings, wherever they are, who are deprived in any way. And that's what, for me, that's the true meaning of Eucharist. And I've said this to you many, many times, that there's a Eucharistic formula. And when you find this formula anywhere in the New Testament, you know that you're in the presence of a Eucharistic banquet. When you meet the 4 phrases, he took, he blessed, he broke, and he distributed, you know you're in the presence of a Eucharistic encounter at that stage. And then what are those 4 phrases? When he took, it is the ability to receive from the planet, our mother, with gratitude. It is not to grasp stuff, not to grasp as if everything belongs to us. There was a famous statement made by the CEO of Monsanto years and years ago that talked about weeds stealing our sunlight, as if sunlight belongs only to the human species. And so for Christ, it is about the gratitude with which you receive from Mother Earth all that she has to offer to us. So you don't grab it, kind of mindlessly or thanklessly. You accept it graciously because it's a gift that our mother is giving to us. That's the first stage of Eucharist. You take with gratitude and with respect. And the second stage is you bless it. And I've said many times, blessing is not doing some kind of a sign over it, as if you're imparting benediction to a previously inert substance. That is not blessing. Blessing, rather, is the recognition of the inherent sanctity of everything that is. So when we bless the Eucharistic speeches at Mass, we're not imparting some kind of divinity into a piece of bread, which is formerly a neutral object. We're recognizing that this is already blessed. It was produced for us by our mother, and we recognize that the blessedness is a recognition, not an imparting of something that didn't previously exist in it. And the third stage for Christ was he broke it. In other words, he had formed the mindset and the intention of sharing it with other people. So breaking the bread has to do with the creation of economic systems in which everybody is provided for. And then the fourth is he distributed. Then we got to walk our talk. There's no point in putting these really fabulous kind of economic systems theoretically into position if they're actually not walked into the world, and if the needs of everybody, whether they're needs for food or for shelter or for security or for education or for medical attention, whatever our needs are as sentient beings, that the systems have to walk into reality and make those actually occur. And so that for me is how I see Christ's understanding of fasting. It is not about personal salvation. It's not about me feeling good, that the hungrier I get, the more sanctimonious I feel. It is not about preventing God's anger from some sin I've committed. It's about reaching out into the oneness. It is seeing the underlying unity again. So point 2 and point 3 come together here. It is, reducing the pluriformity to the oneness. And we see around us then, whether it's beings that live in other solar systems, or it's daffodils, or birds that inhabit our planet with us, seeing that they too are a manifestation of God. And when we see the underlying, life of God in all these things, then we have to there's only one response to that, and that is to care for them.